everybody. This is lecture 2, in which we are going to talk about the historical and cultural context of gender, sexuality, and the body. I always find this unit really interesting and so important to the subject of this course. And that's because, a lot of the sort of categories and ideas connected to gender, sexuality, and the body are so embedded in the cultural context in which we live. They're taken for granted, right? We sort of assume them to be natural or inevitable. And I think what the material in this unit does is really to unpack and sort of denaturalize a lot of those categories, right? Many of the pieces you read in here, certainly in the first several readings, are historical in nature. So they're really kind of showing us the antecedents to the categories that we take for granted in the present day and how they were sort of created over time, right? These did not just emerge from the natural world. A lot of these categories were constructed in very particular ways over time. There's sort of two major themes that are dealt with in this unit. The first is that sort of historical backstory to many of the categories and terms that we use today, right? So that's the Foucault, the Lacour, and the Blank. They're all sort of taking on, some of these fundamental categories and talking about how the modern version of those categories emerged over the last several centuries that, are in place today. The second major theme is trying to look at that idea of categories not being natural by looking cross-culturally. So the Kulik and the Bolstorff are both sort of talking about, both categories from places outside of the sort of Euro-American tradition and the differences, the cultural differences, and how people think about gender, sexuality, and the body. And also sort of the possibilities for change in those categories, right? The historical pieces of this story clearly demonstrate that all those categories change. They don't just emerge, they sort of come from somewhere, and it often takes a lot of cultural work for those categories to land and get traction such that they become invisible, essentially, right? Or we just take for granted that they've always been there, even if they haven't. So Bolstorff in particular, but Kulik as well, are sort of getting at the fact that all of these categories are sort of malleable and they change over time, which also means we can look at current categories or current practices around gender, sexuality, and the body and understand them to be changeable, right? So that's in particular something that Bolstorff is taking on, right? He's actually advocating for change around a certain aspect of gender, sexuality, and the body, which is the use of pronouns. So we'll get to that. That's down the road here. But so in this lecture, then I want to sort of take up those broad themes and then also look at how each of these authors has put forward an argument and some particular examples. So that's what we'll be doing in this lecture today. Okay. So here are what I think are the big accomplishments of the authors that you read for this unit. And this is what I, again, hope that this lecture will demonstrate. One is about the construction of sexuality as a general category. The second is the construction of sex and gender categories, so most obviously male, female, but others as well. And then the third is the construction of categories around sexual identity, right? Categories like the heterosexual, for example. So across all of these readings, you're seeing the historical and cultural processes by which all of these things have been asserted and have become part of our social worlds. So that's where we're going to start. Historicizing and sort of understanding the creation of these phenomena through the work of Foucault, Lacour, and Blank. Okay, so we're going to start with Foucault. Now, I know that Foucault is not the easiest read, but I felt like it was really imperative for me to include this hopefully it wasn't too bad. It's a relatively short excerpt from his book on the history of sexuality because, A, it is so foundational to all the work on these subjects. You may have noted already that a lot of the authors you're reading in some way or another are citing Foucault. So part of it is that it's so foundational. And part of it, too, is that it's just really interesting to read, I think. I mean, I understand that the language can be a bit of a slog, but what he has sort of uncovered is really interesting and was a sort of radical set of discoveries at the time, right? Foucault, if you've read any of the other things that he's written, this is sort of a piece of the kind of work that he does, or an example of the kind of work that he does. A lot of Foucault's work is what he calls an archaeology of the institutions and categories that animate the contemporary world. So he's really interested in tracing out where taken for granted things, practices, ideas come from. So in this case, in this book, he's tracing out the emergence of, essentially, of sexuality as a phenomenon. So again, something we tend to think of as some kind of innate, just sort of natural capacity or instinct. He's saying, not really. Not to say that humans haven't been sexual for sort of all of humanity, but that the particular understanding of sexuality as a distinctive domain with specific qualities, the one that we understand now, that has a very particular genealogy, and he strives to uncover all the layers and all the steps in that process that have led us here. Okay, so for all those reasons, I thought it was important to include at least a short reading from Foucault. So let me walk you through what I think is important about what he's saying here. So the first is that sexuality, in fact, is not natural. It's not just a given. It's not something sort of beyond analysis, right? He says that instead, we need to understand sexuality as a historical construct. And he's going to tell us, as specifically as he can, what the history of that sexuality is, right? Where did it come from? The modern notion of sexuality, where did it come from? What he finds when he does this sort of, again, archaeology or excavation of the concepts is that sexuality, in fact, is not some kind of inner drive, but it is, as he calls it, an especially dense transfer point for relations of power. So in other words, sexuality does a lot of different kinds of things. It's not just about the desires or sort of practices of particular individuals. It's, as he says, a dense transfer point for relations of power. So this is the story he wants to sketch out, or partially sketch out in this reading. Okay. So, again, thinking of this as a history, right? He's pretty specific about the timeline, right? He talks about particularly the 18th to 19th centuries as the historical moment in the West for the emergence of what we understand as our modern understanding of sexuality. And what he finds when he looks up this era is that it is a time for the emergence of 4 of what he calls strategies, and each is connected to a particular figure or sort of a type of person. So what he's talking about here is how sort of social phenomena that came into being during this era have been instrumental in constructing our understanding of sexuality that continues today, all right? So what are those 4 strategies and or figures, right? These 4 kind of trends that he wants to highlight. The first is what he calls the hysterization of women's bodies. You may have heard of an illness that was quite widespread in the 19th century called hysteria, which afflicted primarily women. The hysterization of women's bodies is the assertion that, first of all, women's bodies are sort of inherently sexual or sexualized, infused with sexuality. Second, that there's something inherently pathological about women's bodies, particularly as in that form, right? Like the sexuality of women is also pathological. Their reproductive and sexual organs are disordered. They cause illness. They're sort of out of control in some way. This was a lot of that sort of 18th, 19th century narrative about women's bodies, as we'll see in a minute, coming from medicine and science as well as sort of public perceptions. And that hysterization also sort of connects to the role of motherhood. So, for example, he talks about the image or the typecast of the nervous mother as connecting kind of all of those things. The second is attempts to control children's sexuality. Again, if the figure or the typecast for the pathologization of women's bodies is the hysterical woman, quote unquote, then the figure that connects to trying to control or enforce with children's sexuality is the masturbating child, right? So there was a sense that children's sexuality was not under control, that it was sort of dangerous, it was not yet socialized. Connected to this were things like, again, from this era, extreme concern about masturbation. It was, as we'll see later in the lecture, a cause of public concern. It was something there was attempt to control, both sort of through medicine and science and in daily life and in homes and in families. The third of these strategies and figures is a concern with procreation and really the regulation of population. So this was focused on couples and the idea of their responsibility for reproducing the social body, right? So ideas about fertility and reproduction that were both about the pressure to create enough children to sort of reproduce the society and concerns about things like contraception, but also the concerns about overpopulation. So all of these ideas about the size and nature of populations connected to the procreative behavior of couples. And then finally, what he calls the psychiatrization of perverse pleasure, right? So the idea of medicalizing what are understood as, quote unquote normal or quote unquote not normal sexualities, the pathologization of certain kinds of acts or certain kinds of persons, and the implementation of things like correctives for those, right? There were treatments for what were understood as sexual pathologies in various people, right? So these were the four major trends that Foucault identified in this sort of 18th to 19th century transition, right? Really, these things became a taken for granted part of Euro-American society by the 19th century that he wants to then kind of trace out and focus on. So what he's saying is that these developments, right, this sort of emerging preoccupation with these four areas contributed to the production of sexuality as we know it, okay? He's partly, because this is a history, he's partly talking about a change from what came before this era to what happened in this era, right? So that change, he suggests, the linchpin in that change from the previous era to the era that he's addressing was focused on the family, okay? Family units. And what he says is the family continued to be sort of the central site for how all of these things were enacted, but it was shifted from being about the social body to being about the physical individual body, right? He talks about, to paraphrase him, he says there was a shift from concern with relations to concern with flesh, right? So the idea of society being built on alliance, meaning sort of social units, particularly familial units or familial lineages, etc., there was a shift of that to a focus on sexuality through things like procreation and again, particularly the control of bodies in the service of the role of sexuality in building a society. Okay, so this was a sort of watershed moment that he's talking about by focusing on this era. So there's a few things going on, right? And this is the kind of phenomenon where there's a change in how everyday people live their lives and imagine themselves and imagine their relationships and all of that. And that is happening in concert with some big social changes, right? So there's that back and forth between social change and a change in people's lives, right? So part of that change was social or societal, things like changes in family forms, changes in class structures. Part of it was changes in certain institutions or the rise of certain institutions. So the rise of sort of the modern form of medicine and rise in the role of science, right, in informing how people think about the world and how they do things, right? So what he finds is that by the mid-19th century, like through this transformative process, so into the sort of Victorian era, families were the site of sexuality and the control of sexuality. That there was a sort of policing of sexuality that now was centered on the family, but was also buttressed by physicians, by scientists, right? By this sort of increasingly sort of powerful body of knowledge that was used as the backstop to control sexuality in immediate sort of private spheres, okay? So what he finds is that counterintuitively, or sort of contrary to, I think, a lot of our images that we think of when we think of the Victorian era as very sort of buttoned up and conservative in certain ways, particularly around things like gender, that in fact the Victorian family became the place for the creation and amplification of sexuality, not for its repression, right? There was a lot of policing of that sexuality going on, but it wasn't about like stopping sexuality. It was about amplifying certain versions of sexuality. So in fact, the Victorian family, he says, was a very sort of sexualized sphere in certain ways, okay? So, you know, this is an example of one of the ways that these historical trends that Foucault was talking about instantiated at that time, right? So one of the things he talked about was the hystericization of women's bodies, right? The pathologizing of particularly women's reproductive and sexual organs that was part of that story he's telling. And indeed, we can look to the 19th century and look at an illness category called hysteria that was quite widespread at the time. And it was something that was understood as both sort of, again, about the sort of gynecology of women, but it was also neurological, it was psychological, you know, it was sort of this encompassing condition. And it was attributed at the time, right, to sort of medical people at the time, to the inherent pathology and disorder of women's bodies. Now, it had real effects on people, right? I'm not saying this is a sort of made-up thing in the sense of how people experienced it. So there were lots of women in the 19th century who experienced some of these conditions that left them bedridden, etc., right? But again, and this is sort of veering into medical anthropology a little bit, which is also an area that I am very interested in, but this is an illness category that is sort of an exemplar of what Foucault's talking about in terms of how shifts in that moment in time created certain understandings of bodies and sexuality that, you know, came out in all kinds of ways, including the illness category of hysteria. Okay, so there's Foucault, and that his discussion again is about the history of sexuality as an overarching category as we know it today. All right. You've also done readings that speak to the construction of sex and gender categories, okay? And I want to start with a little bit of a sidebar. I'm sure you've noticed that multiple authors in this unit reference Judith Butler, and particularly this book called Gender Trouble, which is from 1990. And I think her approach to this question of sex versus gender are they different? Are they the same? What are they? Is the reason it gets cited so often is because, again, it's kind of a fundamental contribution to the broader discussion of unpacking sex and gender categories. So I wanted to just talk for a sec about the kinds of things that she says, and then we'll go more back into the readings you read for this unit. So what Butler talks about in Gender Trouble is the idea that, often the assumption, and this continues to today, but she was taking it out and sort of trying to deconstruct it in 1990. The assumption is sex is biology, gender is culture, to put it in a shorthand way, right? That sex is sort of what nature hands us. It's like embedded in bodies. And gender is the more fluid cultural elaboration of those. Butler questioned that. Basically what she said is sex is not separate from gender, right? And also gender does not come from sex. In fact, sex comes from gender, okay? So she's saying sex is also a culturally and historically specific set of categories, and these are therefore inherently unstable categories. They're not carved into stone. You aren't just born with it, right? So, the sort of famous quote from her book that encapsulates this main idea of hers is this: gender ought not to be conceived merely as the cultural inscription of meaning on a pre-given sex. Gender must also designate the very apparatus of production whereby the sexes themselves are established. The internal stability and binary frame for sex is effectively secured by casting the duality of sex in a pre-discursive domain. This production of sex as the pre-discursive ought to be understood as the effect of the apparatus of cultural construction designated by gender. Okay? So she's saying sex wasn't there before we started talking about it, right? And constructing categories around it. It's just as much a social construction as gender, all right? So this was a pretty, incredible idea at the time, and a lot of people have taken up that sort of baton of trying to think about and demonstrate how we should think about sex categories like male and female, and what their relationship is to the many varied gender categories we see in the world, all right? So that's just like a little backstory to how people in anthropology and other fields are theorizing sex and gender categories. All right, so this brings us to Lacour. I should say, as a sidebar, I should have said this in the beginning, that the folks you're reading in the first part of this unit, Foucault, Lacour, Blank, they're not anthropologists, okay? Anthropology, cultural anthropology, is very conversant with other fields, right? It tends to be, there's a thing that is cultural anthropology, right, that is distinctive, and there's a whole body of literature within cultural anthropology. And cultural anthropologists have often and continue to find inspiration and, relevant ideas and theories in adjacent fields. Particularly in the humanities and elsewhere, right? So lots of anthropologists have drawn on things like history and philosophy, and particularly some of the folks I'm having you read here, like Foucault and Lacour, because they had groundbreaking work as historians, have become part of the conversation of cultural anthropology, right? So Foucault he's often billed as a historian and philosopher. He's really kind of a social theorist who grounds his social theorizing in history. Lacour is a historian, right? So he does work of, looking at the past and understanding things that happen in processes, and, some of which are relevant to today, a lot of which are, right? Blank, who's the last person we're going to talk about for this first part, is a more recent sort of contemporary historian, right? So she's not been influential as much in cultural anthropology, but again, these are all kinds of work and kinds of analyses that are absolutely relevant to cultural anthropology. So, Lacour, historian, looking at the emergence of sex categories. And again, starting from that premise that these are not just natural and inevitable and obvious categories of people, that instead we can look to the history of how sex differences have been conceptualized and find that in fact it hasn't been the same, right, over time. And again, for now, Lacour is just looking in the sort of Western tradition. If we look beyond the West, as we will later on in this lecture, there's even more variation, right? So, if there's a big banner over this whole lecture, it's that cultural and historical variation is our source of understanding of concepts and categories, and it helps us unpack them and deconstruct them. So Lacour is looking at a certain shift in a similar era, like he's looking at the same time frame as Foucault, and there's a lot of overlap, and you may have noticed that Lacour is citing Foucault, right, who worked before him. So he looks to, or he identifies the 18th century as a moment of change in understandings of sex categories and bodies and the sex categories they may or may not be a part of, right? That connection. What he finds when he looks historically, and he looks back into things like old, medical texts, like old treatises by, people who were sort of asserting medical ideas of their day, to see how these ideas have shifted over time, right? So what he finds when he looks across time is that before the 18th century, there was a underdeveloped idea of there being distinct sex categories. So in other words, the distinction between a category called male and a category called female was not very clear and not well defined, right? So he looks to the moment where that changes, and he talks about an 18th century shift from what he calls a one-sex model to a two-sex model. The change, he suggests, is one where in the one-sex model, male and female were not understood as opposites or totally different types, but as different versions of the same thing. In the shift to the two-sex model, there was a difference both in the hierarchy between those kinds of bodies and an idea that there was something more radically different about them. So, to illustrate this, if you look to the image on this slide, these are drawings from the 16th century medical illustrations of the female reproductive system. You probably notice right away that they look a lot like the male reproductive organs, right? And what what Lacour suggests is that that's not an accident, right? So in fact, women's bodies were understood to be parallel to men's bodies. This is that one-sex model. One set of organs was external, one set of organs was internal, but they were the same thing. The female version was just a less perfect version of the male, but they were not radically different. And this had all kinds of implications for people's understandings of things like reproduction. So, for example, before that shift, he says female orgasm was understood to be necessary for conception, right? These were two parallel systems, like the same system, basically, but one outside, one inside. So he's, again, tracing out sort of how this change happened and what it looked like. The change, he says, was partly the result of certain kinds of scientific discoveries of that era. For example, the role of ovulation, the role or lack of role of orgasm in conception, and the distinction or the possibility of separating out sexual pleasure from procreation, right? There was also involved in this a change in society. So this was things like the emergence of certain institutions of social society. So I say here, see Foucault. So what Foucault's talking about, right? Those social changes and how they ended up getting kind of mapped onto bodies. Lacour is talking about a similar thing, although he's taking a sort of slightly different angle on it. So the emerging then distinction, this 18th century distinction between male and female, right? And as the idea that male and female bodies were not just two versions of the same thing, but were radically different categories of persons, contributed to the increasing regulation of sexuality in that era. Again, very connected to the things that Foucault tells us in his piece. So, as one example of how that emergence of ideas about sexed bodies contributed to also an emerging set of ideas about sexuality and the need to control them, he gives the example of the development in the 18th century of a real concern with the dangers of masturbation. As he points out, before that era, nobody really cared, right? It was not considered some kind of a scandal or a problem, for people to do that. So the emergence of this, quote unquote, problem of masturbation, he says, had to do with all these social changes, right? Including those sort of medical scientific changes in understandings of bodies, but also changes in the way people socialize and things like the advent of print, right? Like, so that ideas were circulating in a different way. People who thought, which at the time was called onanism, right? Masturbation. People were in a position to create pamphlets and other kinds of publications to circulate. So there's both a change in understandings of bodies, understandings of sexuality, power dynamics around asserting what quote-unquote healthy and quote-unquote degenerate sexuality was about, and then a mechanism to circulate those ideas more broadly, right? So the images on the screen are a couple of examples of those pamphlets that people put out saying, like, masturbation is bad, right? It's bad for your health, it's bad for society, it's immoral, all the various things, it's dangerous, right? So, this, again, he uses as an example both of how ideas about sexed bodies connected to the emergence of ideas about sexuality, and how the emergence of these categories immediately led to power dynamics around social control of those phenomena, right? So, again, this connects to Foucault and what he says in his piece, and it also connects to the next of our themes, which is the construction of particular categories of sexuality. So if Foucault was talking about the sort of the umbrella category of sexuality at all, what Blank is talking about is the emergence of sexual identities, right? Or what used to be referred to as sexual orientations. We don't use that terminology much anymore. But in particular, she is focusing on the emergence of heterosexuality, right? The book that this thing you read is an excerpt from is called Straight, The Surprisingly Short History of Sexuality. Surprisingly Short History of Heterosexuality. So she's starting from the premise that this taken for granted category of heterosexuality has a history. And in fact, perhaps surprisingly, that history is not very deep, right? It is not that long that even the term heterosexual has been in use. This is the story she's going to tell, okay? So she starts with the idea that the categories we often use to talk about sexuality and sexual identity, categories like heterosexual, homosexual, bisexual, etc., are inherently premised on this assumption about the sexes, right? And about the idea that there are two sexes, right? That it's a binary. Now, of course, we know that there's actually a much broader range of sexes. We can turn back to Judith Butler, right, who says sex doesn't exist per se, except insofar as it's an effect of gender. We can also look to the biology itself, right? I mean, one of the things that Blank does in the beginning of the book is talk a bit about her own partner, right, who has an XXY genetic profile, right? So not XX and not XY, XXY. So the idea that there's actually a broader range of variations than two sexes is something that's been a part of feminist critiques for a long time. And indeed, one of the scholars that Blank refers to is Anne Fausto Sterling, who's a biologist by training, but has also written a lot about the history of science. And in the 90s, she published a piece that she called The Five Sexes, Why Male and Female Are Not Enough. And in that piece, she actually sketched out a range of 5 sexes, I think mainly to be sort of provocative and beg the question, because in fact, as she argues, there's probably many more than that, and it's really more of a continuum. So in that piece, Fausto Sterling says, if the state and the legal system have an interest in maintaining a two-party sexual system, they are in defiance of nature. For biologically speaking, there are many gradations running from female to male. And depending on how one calls the shots, one can argue that along that spectrum lie at least 5 sexes, and perhaps even more. Indeed, I would argue further that sex is a vast, infinitely malleable continuum that defies the constraints of even 5 categories. So very much sort of contributing to some of the questions and critiques that Blank is putting forward. So, part of what Blank's project is doing then is suggesting that sex and sexuality are historical artifacts. So not unlike what Foucault and Lacour find, we need to sort of go back and look at the timeline and look at the historical events that lead to the creations of some of the categories that we may now take for granted. In her case, she's looking specifically at this category, heterosexuality, which emerged in the 1860s. What she suggests about the emergence of that category is that, in fact, it wasn't like the result of some kind of scientific discovery. Although medicine and science were complicit in the creation and the sort of coming into sort of everyday language of the term. But in fact, it was largely because of social changes, particularly in the way society was organized and in a shift from basing sort of expectations around behavior from mandates coming from the church to those coming from a secular state. So what I'd say Blank's real project is here in this book is to denaturalize quote-unquote natural categories. That is, unpacking and deconstructing and sort of excavating, right, in the same way that Foucault did, categories that we think of as being unchanging aspects of nature. So what that project entails is what I'm calling marking the unmarked. The framework of marked and unmarked categories is useful here. The idea is with that sort of usage or that language is that categories that are dominant are considered to be the most sort of natural or unquestionable. They're often sort of invisible, right? So in this case, heterosexuality is that sort of unmarked category, right? So she, instead of letting that continue to be taken for granted, considered natural, considered the default, she's marking it. So she's saying it is as constructed as any of these other categories and requires just as much a sort of explanation for what it is and why it is. All right. So her premise in pursuing this project is, as she says, the history of, quote, the heterosexual lurks unexamined not just in our beliefs about our inmost private selves, but also in our beliefs about our bodies, our social interactions, our romances, our family lives, the way we raise our children, and of course our sex lives. So, in other words, understanding this category of heterosexuality and where it came from is important because it actually connects to all kinds of things about how we live our lives. Okay, so she is starting from her historical understanding that these categories and names for different sexualities as types of people did not exist before the 1860s. The Catholic Church, long before that, had various kinds of mandates against non-procreative sex, but it was the sexual act that was mandated against, and it didn't sort of attach to a category or type of person. So this sort of new model of sexual desire and sexual activity as a reflection of self and identity as a type of person, this is the shift that she's talking about. And again, it connects directly to what Foucault said and what we've already discussed as regards to Foucault's thinking about the emergence of some of these categories. So why did these categories emerge, right? Or specifically this category of heterosexuality? As she describes it, it had a lot to do with social changes in this era, particularly the rise of industrialization and the related rise of urbanization. So in the 19th century, there were changes in work and production that led to the growth of cities as working people moved into those cities. So population density increased as people moved to, for example, get things like factory jobs. This created a new kind of social space, right? The city, densely populated. You're not connected to, and you don't know all the people in the town or village you live in. Instead, it's this sort of big anonymous space. There's new kinds of leisure activities, all kinds of things going on in cities that were really not part of life before that. Parallel to that, there was a rise in certain ideas, some coming out of science and others sort of connecting to popular imagination about evolution, about social hierarchies. Industrialization and urbanization also led to some changes in class systems. And all of that sort of converged in cities in this era. And what it led to was the rise of the state trying to manage and regulate sex in cities, right? So there was sort of public concern about the variety of sort of sometimes illicit kinds of sex that were happening in urban settings. And there was a rise also then in the state wanting to control that and regulate that. All of this was in the interest of protecting another sort of rising social phenomenon of this era, which is the middle class family, right? So the secular state needed a sort of basis or legitimization for these sort of rules to control social and sexual behavior. In the past, that kind of justification came from religious mandates from the church. In this era, it was science that provided that justification. For example, she notes the physician Krafft Ebing, a German physician from the 1880s, who was particularly interested in what he considered to be sexual disorders. So he wrote this book that you see the cover of here, which was really about doing like a taxonomy of different sexual disorders, naming them, categorizing them, and he inadvertently in this book, as she says, and there's like a backstory that we'll talk about in a sec, he established the term heterosexual as an accepted medical term. He didn't come up with heterosexual, that came from a different set of conversations, but it was this book that put that forward and made it a part ultimately of common language. So part of this story then is the role of science more generally. As Blank notes, science, one of the fundamental sort of roles of science is to catalog and name things, right? To identify things, to sort of apply an understanding to them. And that often means doing a taxonomy. And, she notes, science is not neutral. It's social. It reflects its cultural context, which includes the biases and prejudices of the scientists who do that science, right? So as one example of that, she talks about the famous 18th century naturalist Linnaeus, who set out to produce basically a taxonomy of all living things. So he's one of the sort of biggest names in this scientific function of categorizing things. But as you also read, he smuggled a lot of sexuality into his naming of things like plants. So what she's getting at here is that the categorizing of things by scientists and physicians is not a neutral act, right? It turns what are often variations of things or continua of things into discrete objects. So this is what she said happened. This tendency to categorize and name in the scientific tradition was in this era applied to sexuality. And in so doing, it turned various kinds of sexual activities and other things related to sex into what were considered to be natural objects. So it did this sort of almost retrospective process of suggesting that these sexualities were natural and inevitable and timeless, when in fact it was creating them in that time. So, again, thinking about the context in which all of this took place. I already mentioned the importance of the middle class. The rise of the middle class was about constructing a new sort of social space within society. And as Blank describes it, the middle class family had particular characteristics that are important to its connection to sexuality. So the middle class family had qualities or sort of specific aspects of it, like the focus on autonomy and the role of privacy in the family. And, as she says, a real focus on sexuality in certain ways, right? So, this is one of the parts of the story that may feel counterintuitive, that Victorian middle-class families, which we think of as sort of straight-laced, were, in fact, a site of the production of sexuality as we know it. There was a broader sort of socio-political project connected to the middle-class family. The middle-class family was understood as sort of the backbone of the nation. So a strong, healthy nation was premised on, again, this is the sort of ideology of the time. A strong, healthy middle-class family was the backbone. So a strong nation needed those families. And this was, in the political context as well of European nations acting as colonizers of the rest of the world, right? So this was an era when European countries were claiming the land and resources and people of non-Europeans across the globe. And again, justifying that was premised in part on this idea of the respectability of middle-class families. So making a distinction between Europeans and others based on things like family and sexuality. Now, the flip side of the sort of the strong and respectable middle-class family was the fear of certain effects of being middle class. So Blank notes, for example, the rise of a condition called neurasthenia. I mentioned hysteria earlier, which was sort of an affliction that typically affected women. Neurasthenia is a sort of parallel condition that affected men as well as women. And it was understood to be sort of the result of middle-class men, not being virile or manly enough. This was another way in which medicine was implicated in asserting certain boundaries around sexuality, right? So manliness meant a certain sort of sexuality that was both about potency, but it was also controlled, right? So there was a sort of legitimized form of that manly sexuality that wasn't, just any kind of male sexuality, but it was a certain version of male sexuality. There occurred then, in this context, several events sort of in sequence that, as Blank tells us, sort of had a real effect on the rise of heterosexuality as a category, right? So the first of these was, in this context, German laws around sexuality were revised. This was, again, this sort of shift from the church being the primary referent for governing to secular states that often turned to science as a basis for governing. And in the revision of these German sex laws, or laws related to sex, it became illegal for men to have sex with other men. So some of the reactions to that law on the part of particular individuals are part of the story of the rise of heterosexuality. And this is what Blank sort of sketches out for us. So these are sort of the details of history, right, that happen to lead to heterosexuality. So there's both some big, broad things happening, and there's the role of particular individuals in particular events, right, which is the case generally in history. So she tells us about a couple of individuals who were part of this rise of the category heterosexual. The first is a guy named Ulrich, who was, as she describes, a gay man, or at least what we would say is a gay man today, a man who was attracted to other men, who spent his life basically arguing for the fact that same-sex sexuality is natural and normal and shouldn't be punished. He was a man who was fired from his job because of his attraction to other men. And so he sort of saw that injustice and worked toward trying to overcome it, right? Or at least respond to it. As she describes it, he did so through a particular theory about same-sex sexuality that he called sexual inversion. So not trying to really address the root of the problem, but again, doing another sort of different kind of taxonomy of sexualities. Another player in this story is a man named Kurt Benny. And Ulrich and Kurt Benny knew of one another, right, and were both writing about similar things at the time. But Kurt Benny took a different approach to same-sex sexuality, and that was his focus on human rights. So he thought of homosexuals and heterosexuals, as he called them, as being parallel and equal types of people, both deserving of the same human rights. And he said as much in a letter in the 1860s to Ulrich, right? And this is, according to Blank, the first usage of those terms to describe these different sort of sexualities. So heterosexuality as a term ultimately became adopted into common language as part of sort of popular understanding by the early 20th century, right? So these are all sort of steps along the way. And it was through Krafft Ebing, right, the author of the book about, quote unquote, sexual disorders, that the term was really broadcast. So he picked up on Kurt Benny's terms, incorporating them into his book, and that sort of broadened the range of the use of this term. Now, Krafft Ebing wasn't using the terms in the same way that Kurt Benny had as a basis for universal human rights. Krafft Ebing had sort of a focus on what he considered to be sexual disorders. He had a very limited view of what a quote-unquote healthy sexuality was. But he did establish in common knowledge at the time the notion of the heterosexual. So Blank then sort of sums all this up, this story that she tells us, by saying, with the help of good old-fashioned scientific taxonomy, a model for sexual desire and activity between men and women had not only been legitimized, it had been made emblematic of an inherent physical and psychological normalcy that suited both respectable middle-class families and the well-regulated secular state. The modern heterosexual had officially been born. Okay, so I'm going to transition now to our second big theme for this unit, which I call culture at work, creating categories. So what we're doing in this part of the unit is really looking at three specific sort of cultural examples of the creation and use of categories around sex, gender, sexuality, bodies. So what I'm intending for this to sort of do is to be some specific examples of some of the broader processes that we've been reading about and learning about in the first part of the unit, right? So all of that sort of historical backstory and the cultural and historical processes by which categories come into being in these three readings, or these two readings and then the film, I'm hoping you'll see like some specific ethnographic examples of what that looks like in practice, right? So again, thinking both across culture and over time about variations in categories and how they're put into practice. So we've got the Kulik article, which is about a group of people called travestis in Brazil. We've got the Bolstorff article, which is not so much ethnographic as it is sort of a critical anthropological essay. He's talking about the usage, modern contemporary usage of pronouns in English. And then I want to reference the film that you're also watching. So those are sort of the three examples. So Kulik is an anthropologist who has done long-term field work in Brazil with a group of people that are called travestis. And sort of there's some broad points that he makes, and then he also gives us lots of details in the ethnographic tradition about the lives of these individuals. So the sort of the broad strokes, the big points he wants to make, are that in any cultural context, right, there are specific models of sexuality and specific models of gender. They're not universal. And we can also find culturally specific relationships between sexuality and gender. So part of what he's doing here is describing for us one cultural model of sexuality and cultural model of gender, and then how they basically constitute one another. So it is culturally specific, but it also speaks more generally, again, to this issue of sort of categories and how they're brought into being. So what he finds is the key distinction in the Brazilian context in which he is working is not between men and women or between heterosexual and homosexual. The key distinction, culturally speaking, is a division between those who penetrate and those who are penetrated. So in other words, it's not about variations in men's sexuality per se, or not just about that. It's also about a particular understanding of gender, which he says is a binary between men and not men. And we'll talk more about that in a second. So, this is a cover of Kulik's book about the travestis of Brazil. And what he tells us is that travestis are sort of well known and recognized across Brazilian society. Some, in fact, are very famous, like Roberta Close, who's in an image here on the screen, who was very famous in the 1980s and was considered the most beautiful woman in Brazil, and was a travesti. However, although some are famous, what Kulik found is that most travestis were marginalized, they were discriminated against. They typically worked as prostitutes. And they were, considered to be sort of on the outskirts of society. So they're recognized, they're considered part of the social fabric, but they also suffered a lot in terms of their place in society. What made the travestis, like the specific sort of characteristics, had to do both with bodily practices and bodily self-presentation and with their sexual relationships. And these are the sort of ethnographic details that Kulik provides for us. So in terms of bodily practices, there was a literal transformation of the body that went with being a travesti. That entailed the use of both hormones and literally injecting silicone into the body in order to meet idealized beauty standards for female beauty that were in place in Brazil. Now, that said, as Kulik uncovered, it was not the case that the travestis thought they were women or wanted to be women. They were not interested in transitioning. What they did want was to feel quote unquote feminine and to be attractive to men. And these practices of using hormones, injecting silicone, were part of that. The other key part of the travesti identity is their sexual relationships. And Kulik describes the sort of two primary kinds of sexual relationships that they were involved in. The first was with boyfriends. And these boyfriends were were understood as straight men, basically, right? They were involved in sort of domestic relationships with travestis, and their sexual interactions were that the maridos, right, the husbands or boyfriends, were sexually penetrating the travestis. It was a sort of one expected form of sexual interaction between them. He described even how travestis, if a boyfriend wanted to be penetrated or wanted to pay sort of too much attention to the travesti's penis or other parts of their body, that was kind of a deal breaker, right? Like that was not the arrangement. The arrangement was that the boyfriend penetrated the travesti partner, and that was the basis for both the sexuality of that relationship and the gender roles. Travestis also engaged in other sexual relationships with the clients, right? Remember that they're acting or working as prostitutes. In those relationships, the travesti was the penetrator and the client was the penetrated, right? And as Kulik notes, in fact, a lot of the reason that clients went to these travestis was because of that arrangement, because of that sort of sexual relationship, right? That the travesti would penetrate the client. So, these are two different sort of variations on both sexual roles and gender roles. And as Kulik describes it, both gave certain kinds of satisfaction or pleasure, right, to the travesti. And they didn't want to give up either. So, where does Kulik sort of land in his discussion of all this? One thing I'll say is, and you probably noticed this about this article, is that Kulik is engaging in a sort of writing that in anthropology we often call reflexive. And what that means is that he talks about his own experiences and his own position in the social scenes that he's describing. So he's not acting like, a fly on the wall observing things. He says, I was there and I was standing with my friends and then this happened, right? And another part of that I actually really appreciate about this article is that he also describes the process by which he comes to understand things. Like he will say, well, at first I thought this, but then I learned this, or at first I was confused about this, and then I figured out that. So he describes like some of the things that he found unexpected, right? Or he didn't think that he would find, or were different than in other cultural contexts, but were important to understanding gender and sexuality among the travestis. So, for example, he found that unlike other accounts of prostitution, that the travestis enjoyed the sex they had with their clients. He also found that, in fact, they didn't need to have sex to make money, but they still did. And that they didn't need to transform their bodies to work as prostitutes, but they still did, right? So there's some things going on here, he realized, that went to ideas about gender and sexuality, right, that were beyond those specific issues. So his main findings, or his main argument here, is that in Brazil, the travestis are reflecting a culturally specific configuration of gender and sexuality. So in other words, gender and sexuality inform one another, and all of these things are culturally specific. The travestis in this Brazilian gender system are not a third gender, right? There's some ethnographic examples that anthropologists talk about where the quote-unquote third gender category, where there's a category of people who are sort of neither men nor women. And in fact, you'll find when you watch the film about the Fa-Fa-Fines, right, that it's a little bit different in that regard. But what he says that in Brazil, he's saying that's not the case. Like the travestis are not carving out an additional social space beyond male and female, or men and women, or men and not men, as he calls it. Instead, he says they are working within a very rigid binary, right? There are only two gender categories, right? But those categories are men and not men. And not men includes both women and some men, particularly men who are penetrated, right? So in other words, what he finds is in this gender system, the gender of women is fixed, but the gender of men fluctuates. And the gender of men is transformed by certain sexual activities. So again, there's that interface between gender and sexuality in this particular cultural world. So that's different than the sort of dominant understanding or gender and sexuality system in the Euro-American context, right? As we talked about earlier in this lecture, in the Western tradition, gender is understood to derive from sex, meaning male-female, right? In the Brazilian gender system that he's describing, gender derives from sexuality. So in other words, it's not your genitals, it's what people do with them that determines gender. So in this context, certain sexual acts, specifically penetration, is transformative and it's engendering, right? So in keeping with this model, then, he finds that travestis, for example, think that gay men are hiding and not being sort of honest about their position relative to that binary. He quotes a travesti as saying gay men are pretending to be men, right? Whereas travestis are sort of honestly presenting themselves as not men, right? So the idea here is that there's only two categories, right? And the travestis are part of the not men category. Another example he gives to underline this is that travestis who are not considered to be beautiful by sort of local standards are often scorned. And that's because it's not because they are failed men, right? It's because they are failed not men. So the category to which they are a part, right, is the not men category. So that is when they're not being not men enough, right, is when there is scorn. So it's not about a man, it's about a not man, if that makes sense, right? It's a little counterintuitive. So gay men are not perceived in the same way that travestis are, and are not understood to be transgressing boundaries in the same way. So I'll just reference here the film that you're also watching as part of this unit, which is called Paradise Bent. It's about a category of people in Samoa called Fa'afafine. And, you know, I think you'll see some parallels and some differences with the travesti example. So I just want to suggest that when you watch the film, that you pay attention to what the similarities and differences are between the travesti category and the Fa'afafine category. How are those gender categories understood, and how do they operate in their respective societies? And again, in what ways are those understandings and those roles different or the same? It's a really interesting film, and I hope you enjoy it. And I think it makes a good sort of comparative example with Kulik's article. Okay, so the final piece for this unit is one that takes us to sort of contemporary English usage. And Bolstorff is specifically talking about the use of pronouns, especially recently. And he's comparing the use of preferred pronouns to the idea of a more radical, inclusive approach to gendered pronouns in English, which is the idea of adopting they, them as the only third person pronoun, right? So he's suggesting that that move would be the more radically inclusive and is something that he thinks is a superior way to address this issue of how language relates to, these different sort of social categories in the world. He calls the they, them third person pronoun an epicene pronoun, by which he means it's sort of a generic, it's not gendered, and moving to it means it would be the standard third person singular pronoun for everybody, right? This is what he's suggesting. And he says the reason to do that is that it addresses the problem of exclusion or inequity in language at its root. It's more of a structural shift, he suggests, than the use of preferred pronouns. And this is really what he's talking about in this article. Why he thinks that's a more radical move, why he thinks it's a better way to address it, and what the sort of pros and cons are of these different ways of addressing inclusion or exclusion in the use of pronouns. So he, absolutely agrees with many of the premises for using preferred pronouns, that he, she is exclusionary, but he also takes issue with some of the sort of downsides, as he sees it, of using preferred pronouns, particularly that it means that the burden is on the individual who has to repeat their pronoun and is really struggling to get other people to accept it and take it up, right? So he says, again, this is working within the system as it exists. It's not challenging the system and trying to fundamentally change it. He concedes that language inclusion does not necessarily mean social inclusion, right? But language is still important. So it's worth trying to make it work better. And therefore, he thinks this is an important issue, and that's why he writes this article. Okay. So the first way that he addresses this is in terms of the relativity and malleability of language, right? I mean, as an anthropologist, he thinks broadly and cross-culturally about language and notes that, different languages deal with pronouns in different ways. Not all languages have gendered pronouns. Some do, some don't. And those variations suggest that it's possible to have a perfectly functioning language that doesn't have gendered pronouns, right? He also notes that in English, it's not an entirely gendered language. Some languages gender nouns and verbs and lots of things. In this case, he's primarily focusing on this one place of gendered language within English, which is third-person singular pronouns, right? And he also talks a little bit about the history of challenges to pronoun systems in English, which have a long history, right? In an earlier era, the debate was really about the assertion of he as a universal pronoun. So, I'm old enough to remember a time when he was the default, like when you were writing. Even he or she was not very common. The grammatically correct generic pronoun was he. So it's only in, the mid to late 20th century that particularly feminist scholars challenged that default to he and at least said it needs to be he or she. So that was already sort of something that had to be worked at, and he or she seemed significantly better than just he. So, moving to the much more immediate past, the use of preferred pronouns takes it beyond he or she. And as we all know, right, there's an increasing use of they in written language and in conversation to refer to people in a way that is not gendered at all, right? So, again, he finds certain problems with using preferred pronouns over this epicene they that he's suggesting. It requires the individual to repeat themselves. It requires others to remember, right, which he suggests is ableist in a certain way. And he also connects it to our embeddedness in a global capitalist system where individualism and the need to self-brand is part of a system that, frankly, produces the gender exclusion we're struggling against in the first place. So he's saying in a certain way that using individualized or preferred pronouns sort of buys into that capitalist system and again doesn't strike at the root of the exclusion or the source of the exclusion. So again, his sort of suggestion or argument at the end is to eliminate he, she, and eliminate that process of choosing a pronoun, and instead move towards using they, them for everyone, right? And again, he thinks that's a more radical approach to developing an exclusion or an inclusive way of using pronouns in English. So, this is, he frames his article as notes. So it's kind of provisional. It's like the beginnings of an argument. But I thought it was an interesting piece because it speaks to sort of a very sort of current and emergent issue, and because it's an anthropologist not doing an ethnographic study so much as using the ideas of anthropology to write a critical essay about a contemporary issue. Okay, so we've covered a lot of ground, and this unit, I think, is really about looking to the past to understand the present and thinking about how categories are constructed across culture and through time. I'm hopeful that it'll provide a good basis for many of the other things we'll talk about in the course. So have a good rest of the week, and I'll talk to you soon.